Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dan Attrell, and I'm here with the esteemed Dr. David Porreca, who is the co-translator with myself in the translation of the Picatrix, which will be coming out on February 8th. And I've been doing some talking myself on other podcasts with other people, but it's been hard for David and I to get together and talk about the Picatrix, but finally we've managed to pull it off, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion for you guys today. David, you want to say hi?
Yes, greetings. Hello, everyone. Glad to be here. Finally getting around to doing this. Hopefully everyone will enjoy.
Right, so we're going to try to talk about some aspects of the Picatrix which were not covered elsewhere. So I talked a lot about worldview elsewhere, talked a lot about some of the underpinning mechanisms through which magic operates in the Picatrix. We've talked about sources. So if you want to hear about those discussions, there's plenty of other videos about the Picatrix that you can find on the channel. But for the time being, we want to talk about a couple things. Namely, we want to talk about reception, since that's very important to our project. We want to talk about the recovery of the Picatrix in the 20th century, so the latter portion of the reception. We want to talk about David's personal interest in the Picatrix, since you're the one who essentially started this whole project, and I was only hired in some years into the translation process, so I'd be interested in having a little bit of discussion about that. David will have a word or two about crystals and gems. We'll talk about animal sacrifice. If we have time, we'll touch on the city of Adocentyn, and we'll also talk about the distinction of streams in the Picatrix between the purely talismanic form of magic and the ritual invocatory form of magic, which is kind of evident in the way that the sources are divided. So, without further ado, I think we should probably have a word or two about the reception of the Picatrix. So, David, could you tell me about the translators of the Arabic Gayat al-Hakim, and we can take it from there.
Sounds good, sounds good. One of the foremost scholars who's worked on the Picatrix is David Pingree, who is responsible for editing the Latin text that we used as the basis for our translation. And he, in some of his other articles than that actual publication, identifies very cautiously and tentatively the individuals responsible for putting the Picatrix into first Spanish from Arabic and then from Spanish into Latin. And there's two names that come up in Pingree scholarship. One of them is a Jewish scholar from Spain named Yehuda ben Moshe. And he's one of the translators at King Alfonso's court, which was a great center for scholarship and translation at the time. King Alfonso of Castile was very much a sponsor of scholarship, and there was a whole translation program that he brought about and funded at his court. And at the same court, we have an Aegidius de Tebaldis of Parma. Aegidius is the Latin version of the sort of anglicized name Giles, or Gilles en français. And Aegidius de Tebaldis was an imperial notary, and he was in principle, or Pingree has identified him as the individual who took the Castilian Spanish version that Yehuda ben Moshe had put together from the Arabic and translated that Spanish version into Latin. It seems as though the process of translation wasn't one of literal word for word or sentence by sentence translation. It was an interpretive translation, one which Charles Burnett has identified as, or described as, a translatio ad sensum. In other words, a translation faithful in meaning rather than a literal word for word rendering. Now, In the process, there's also a layer of editing that happens inevitably, whereby a lot of the material that is present in the Arabic is absent from the Latin or is epitomized, summarized. Certain sections come across as a Reader's Digest version of the original Arabic. On the other hand, there's also material that is present in the Latin but absent from the Arabic. So it's a reworking of the text that happens between the Rayat al-Hakim and the Picatrix that's in Latin. And that editing process or reworking process happened between the Arabic and the Spanish, it seems, because some of the other scholarship that's appeared, including by David Pingree, has identified the closeness and the almost literalness between the Spanish and the Latin, and the major differences seem to be inserted between the Arabic and the Spanish versions. So that's one component of the reception of the actual raw translation of the Arabic into Latin.
Could you give a word on Bowdlerization?
Bowdlerization. Thomas Bowdler was a early 19th century clergyman in England and was sort of at the forefront of what became, or what we have since identified as Victorianism, the sort of prudish attitude toward things, that included the creation of new words for certain things when the original word had a sexual double entendre. What comes to mind is his invention of the word rooster for what had previously simply been described as a cock. Another example is the word coney, that's practically fallen out of use in modern English in favor of rabbit, whereas coney does have the double entendre with female genitalia. So, and in our text, we've chosen to de-Bowdlerize. In other words, whenever there was call for translating the Latin word for a male chicken, we chose to put cock in our translation rather than rooster, in reflection of the double entendre that exists in several different European languages, including Latin, when it comes to these things.
Right, but there was also a process at the court of Alfonso, whereby certain aspects of the Gayat al-Hakim were amended, let's say.
Well, certainly, definitely the passage, the Bowdlerization you're talking about is part of this editing process, or the reworking process, whereby material that for the translators would appear to not appeal to their Latinate literate audience were excised or modified. References to the Quran, which are fairly frequent in the original Arabic version, drop to next to nothing and even those passages sometimes get the ones that remain are those that are most consonant with Christianity and Christian interests. Some of the other aspects of Bowdlerization are not religious, but to do precisely with the more prudish sexual mores of the Latin audience as opposed to the Arabic one, whereby references to homosexual sex, for example, have been almost completely excised.
Right.
And there aren't any other examples that come to mind right away. Dan, I don't know if you recall of any.
I think those are the immediate ones. One of them is there is a spell that is to make a girl come to you, and it's sort of like a magical date rape spell, if you will. And in the Arabic version, it's a boy that you are abducting and putting under your control, whereas in the Latin version, it's a girl. So that's another aspect of where we see this kind of uneasiness in the Christian world that is not necessarily echoed in the Islamic world at the time, concerning homosexuals or magic involving homosexual type relationships. And there's a fair deal of mention about homosexuality in the Picatrix, and so not all of it necessarily gets ironed out in the process.
A good proportion of them do. That particular example you bring up brings to mind the observation that that sort of coercive sex magic is not new to the Picatrix by any means. It has a very ancient tradition, and a lot of the love-related spells in the Greek magical papyri from antiquity, for example, have the same sort of very unsettling tone to a modern audience in terms of them being very much for the benefit of the lover, not the beloved. And the reading these spells is actually quite unsettling in terms of the coerciveness that is definitely part and parcel of these magical operations.
Right. Though we also need to consider that relationships across cultures differ. And in some cultures, there is often an active and a passive lover and beloved. That was definitely the case in ancient Greece. But whether that is the case, everywhere else it depends culture to culture. So another aspect about the reception that we could discuss is the disappearance of the Picatrix.
Yeah, it's a text that essentially vanishes from what we know of its circulation from the time of its translation in the latter half of the 13th century, more than likely the 1250s. No one seems to know about it or to quote it much at all until the 1450s, which is a full 200-year span later. There's a small handful of fragments of the text that survive in manuscript from the early 14th century, but the text clearly did not see widespread circulation until the 1450s, when Italian scholars appear to be the ones who first manifested an interest in this material. That being said, when I say interest, it doesn't mean approval of. Right. Because many of these scholars are in fact quite critical of the Picatrix, despite the fact that they quote from it and use it in various places in various ways. Galeotto Marzio, who dies in 1497, is among the original users of the Picatrix in the context of his medical, philosophical, and astrological work. And I know, Dan, you've worked a fair bit on Marsilio Ficino at this point, and he's one of those who is cautious about the Picatrix. Among the first users or first ones manifesting evidence of knowing it quite thoroughly.
And using it.
And using it, exactly. And that's kind of what distinguishes Ficino from many of his contemporaries, like fellow countrymen from this time period, who know of the Picatrix and simply as a vehicle to criticize the practice of magic, whereas Ficino was actually quoting from it extensively in contexts that suggest actual use of those passages.
And Ficino is more interested in the talismanic portion of the magic, which he sees kind of in the Baconian tradition as being entirely natural magic, whereas there is also the invocatory tradition, which is what Ficino denies and is not interested in, because he thinks these are consorting with demons, essentially.
Yeah, and that sort of attitude also manifests even in the physical makeup of the earliest extant version of the manuscript version of the Picatrix that we have, that dates to 1458-59. It's held at the University Library in Krakow, and it's the only Picatrix text that contains the illustrations of the talismanic figures. And when the text dives into talismanic figures for summoning spirits, that is exactly where the illustrator stops his work. There's still space left in the manuscript, but it seems as though the content became distasteful to this Christian illustrator or user of the book or owner of the book, to the extent that they stopped putting the illustrations in at that point. So it's and to observe that the popularity of the Picatrix, once it became known again, is quite substantial. The fact that we have 17 complete manuscripts and multiple excerpt examples from the text that survive from the 1450s to the late 17th century suggests that it was quite popular and was, in fact, probably traded around circles of scholars who were interested in this kind of thing.
Right. One has to wonder if during the period when Picatrix was not mentioned in any literary account, if that's just because the people who were using it were taking very seriously the injunctions to secrecy.
That's quite possible. Those injunctions to secrecy are everywhere in the Picatrix, and they're formulated in different ways but they always come down to don't let this get into the wrong hands. By implication, suggesting that whoever is holding it is the right hands.
Hopefully. I mean, provided they are going through all of the proper purifications and...
What's really interesting is that despite the large number of manuscripts that survive, the book was never printed, which means that no one was willing to attach their name to the printing or the editing of this particular text, which I guess reflects its notorious nature, which it earns to an extent, precisely in terms of the coercive love magic we were mentioning earlier, as well as some of the sort of offensive ingredients, certainly offensive to our modern sensibilities, ingredients that occur quite ubiquitously throughout various sections of the text, using human body parts and excrement and this kind of thing, just reinforces the reputation of magicians or magical practitioners being involved in distasteful things.
Right.
To put it charitably. So in terms of the reception, we also have a Lodovico Lazzarelli, who is a poet and hermeticist from the latter half of the 15th century. Pico della Mirandola is also is known to have owned a copy of the Picatrix, but he tended to be quite critical of it.
Right. Pico was very much against the determinism of astrology and wrote quite extensively against the kind of magic that is contained within the Picatrix, favoring instead Kabbalistic gematria, Pythagorean numerology, lettrism, these kinds of things.
Yeah. Thinking of the Picatrix north of the Alps, the earliest mention of it is in a commonplace book written in 1477 by John Argentine, who was a doctor of medicine at Cambridge and also the personal physician to King Edward V. And so that's the earliest mention north of the Alps. And again, there's a number of manuscripts that originate from not Italy and of the Picatrix, and suggest that the popularity spread rather quickly in terms of geography.
Right. Johannes Hartlieb is the first reference when it resurfaces in the 1450s.
That's right.
And he's German.
Yes.
So Picatrix is definitely in Germany, it's in Poland, it's in Italy, it's in Spain, it's in France.
Because François Rabelais
and
Symphorien Champier, both fairly well-known figures from this time period, are aware of the text, aware enough to be willing to criticize it quite severely. Gabriel Naudet is another one who describes Picatrix, quote, as being a Spanish charlatan who writes about magic. That's what he says the Picatrix is, taking the name Picatrix as the name of the author.
Right, but he would not be the only person. Rabelais does the same.
Yeah, does the same.
Picatrix, I've kind of mentioned this. When I use it, Picatrix is the author, whereas the Picatrix is the text.
Yes.
But yeah, the Picatrix is some kind of bastardization of the attempt to say Maslama, or some kind of encoded version of the name Maslama for Maslama al-Qurtubi, who is the actual author of the text. But what would be the next step in the reception?
Well, first of all, to mention that the translation into Latin wasn't the last translation that happened, because from the Latin, that, as we mentioned earlier, came from a Castilian Spanish version that itself came from the original Arabic. The Latin version was then, either in whole or in part, was translated into English, into French, into German, into Hebrew, and into Italian.
Right.
So it's a text that manifests quite a wide range of interests, and interests clearly among lay people as well, because the clergy at the time would all have known Latin and would not have seen the point of translating this text into these other languages. So the fact that fragments at least are extant in every one of the languages I just mentioned suggests that the interest in this text wasn't only amongst the literati, so to speak, of the time, that some people who were literate, but in their common, sort of the vulgar tongue of the time, were manifest some interest in this material. So it's not only the sort of the clerical underground, as Richard Kiefer calls it. It's not only the clerical underground that's using this text, it's other people as well.
Right. And so a good example of that is when John Dee gets accused of being a conjurer. John Dee is very hostile to this label. He says, I'm not a conjurer. Meanwhile, he's doing his conversations with angels, but what he's doing is Enochian magic. He is using a different system, but the implication is that there were conjurers. There were people who were using these systems that are laid out in the Picatrix, both the talismanic system of doing magic and the invocatory prayers. So there was definitely an underground of practitioners who were not clerics. And I wouldn't be surprised if court astrologers, those astrologers who belonged to the courts of specific princes or dukes, or you'll see everybody during these times, from the Sforzas of Milan to the court of Rudolph II, they all have astrologers, and it's likely that they would have been the people who were trafficking in the book.
Yeah. It so happens that the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I owned 2 copies of the Picatrix. So that's a known factor, and if he did, everyone else, it's sort of an esoteric arms race, so to speak, amongst these royal courts.
Right.
And, one wouldn't want to be caught without the right kind of toolkit to protect themselves from potentially hidden esoteric attacks from enemies and this kind of thing. So their astrologers would certainly make sure that they had all the latest materials on hand, and that would certainly include the Picatrix.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the later reception, we don't hear much about the Picatrix from the 17th century or so until the late 19th, where we have in England the sort of puritanical sentiment that caused everyone, not everyone, but caused a widespread, at least public rejection of this text, expressed by a certain Reverend J. Wood Brown, who said that he said, quote, "It is to be hoped the Picatrix may never be translated into any modern language," end of quote. And he's saying this in 1897. Well, it doesn't take a generation before A.B. Warburg comes across a manuscript of the Picatrix and is very intrigued by this text, because the descriptions of some of the planetary talismans and other astrological talismans correspond, from what he had seen, very closely to some of the frescoes in some northern Italian villas. So it seems as though there was an artistic program afoot in those places that he is the first to put his finger on in terms of identifying the actual source of inspiration for these illustrations.
So that's the Hall of Months in Ferrara.
Yeah, the Palazzo Schifanoia in Ferrara is the most obvious of these places, where the quite beautiful frescoes that are in that particular building, that decorate the inside of the building, correspond very closely to what is described in words in the Picatrix, and that only one manuscript illustrates, and only then to a limited extent.
And specifically, it's the Deccan images.
Exactly. So A.B. Warburg, having realized this connection as an art historian, he is recognizing the Picatrix as a sort of key connecting link between the practice of astrology and Renaissance art, as well as what the owner of said palace would want to portray to his guests in terms of the artistic program, which was it was not in a hidden chamber by any means. These were fairly commonly used rooms in these buildings. So.
Right. Something worth mentioning is that this kind of throws a bit of a wrench in the idea of Renaissance art too, because the idea of Renaissance art is that you are resurrecting these old forms, these classical forms, but evidently, so this is being done, I think, around the 1470s.
Yep.
These are not old forms. These are actually fairly recent developments. These are recent, I don't want to call them innovations, but the Picatrix is not ancient. It wasn't even necessarily perceived of as ancient. It was just thought of as coming from the Arabs.
Although internally it makes many claims for the antiquity of the sources that
Yes.
al-Qurtubi, the now identified author of this book/compilation, he claims to have used 224 different sources in the process of pulling together the Rayat al-Hakim, which turned into the Picatrix, as we were mentioning earlier. He systematically went for more ancient sources when he could get them. And so, in a sense, via the Picatrix come to us material that is probably much older and difficult to identify in terms of how old it actually is.
Yeah, or I think better to say perceived oldness.
Yes, good point.
Because
good point.
Ibn Mushia, not old, contemporary.
True.
Al-Kindi, not old. A lot of these Arab thinkers that he's drawing from, they're all recent or contemporaries. But what they would have perceived about Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and Hermes and these figures, these would have been thought of as definitely ancient. But there's no clear historical consciousness necessarily. There's no sense of the order in which these people came and who influenced whom.
Yeah. The further into the reception of the Picatrix into the 20th century, A.B. Warburg ends up creating a scholarly program for the translation, the edition and translation of both the Latin and the Arabic versions of this text, which were meant to be accompanied by a German translation. And the first work toward this project was done in the 1920s, but was beset with a number of problems relating to the personal lives of the editors involved, as well as political developments in Germany at the time, whereby this was precisely the time at the end of the Weimar Republic and the rise to power of the Nazi regime, wherein Jewish scholarship was essentially frowned upon, and A.B. Warburg himself had to, after his death, the research institute that had been...
Frowned upon is a little light.
Frowned upon, yeah, fair enough. The entire Warburg Institute, after his death, managed to flee from Hamburg to London 2 weeks prior to Goebbels taking over the Ministry of Information. So they had a narrow escape, and the Warburg Institute currently resides as part of the School of Advanced Study at the University of London as a result of the necessity of that move. So they packed up all 60,000 books that Warburg had accumulated over the previous couple of decades, the printing press that had associated itself with the budding research institute, and everybody decamped to London. And initially were housed at the Courtauld Institute, and there's still a common journal, in fact, the Journal of the Warburg and Courtauld Institutes, that emerged out of that happenstance collaboration at the time. Nevertheless, in terms of the Picatrix itself, the individuals involved in the edition were arrested for homosexuality.
We should name them.
Yes, of course. Martin Plessner and
Helmut Ritter,
exactly.
And not with each other.
No, exactly. Plessner is the one who eventually produced the German translation based on the Arabic text that the German translation finally appeared in 1962. In terms of the Arabic material, an introduction by Ritter was published in 1926 that had intended to be the introduction to the whole edition, but it was published separately, and the edition itself never included said introduction. The edition itself of the Arabic was done seemingly in a great deal of haste, because the frontispiece of the Arabic holds a different publication date from the German language frontispiece page. So one says 1927, the other says 1933. So there's a fair amount of confusion. Ritter himself had to go into exile to Istanbul, where he had assorted problems of mental health resulting from the arrest and the trauma involved and so on, such that there was some question as to whether the project would ever be finished. Such as it is, we know that the Arabic text that was published isn't the best edition that's ever been done, let's put it that way. So modern scholars, among them Liana Saif, have identified new manuscripts that provide better readings and so on. And she is currently busily at work on re-editing the Arabic Picatrix.
Almost done.
She's almost done. So you have had more recent contact with her, I think.
Yeah, she set up a Twitter account because she was seeing people spreading rumors online that her work wasn't happening just because it wasn't happening fast enough. And it's like, this is the kind of thing that takes a half a decade to a decade at the very least. So yeah, she's almost done, and so she's been giving updates on Twitter, which is nice.
That's very good news because it's her project complements ours very neatly,
right?
In terms of her also producing an English translation of the text at the same time as editing the Arabic. So, which segues fairly nicely, I guess, into what got me into this particular project. Was recognizing, first of all, that of all modern languages, English was the only one, pretty much, of all modern European scholarly languages. English was the only one that hadn't received proper scholarly translation, such that an obvious need was there because there's a decent French translation. There's one into Italian. There's Martin Plessner's into German from 1962 from the Arabic one. In the meantime, and working in parallel, was the fearless duo of John Michael Greer and Christopher Warnock, who themselves produced an English translation of the Picatrix before ours has appeared. They started on it a little bit before I did as well. And theirs is self-proclaimedly oriented toward an audience of practicing esotericists. Our translation is, which I know you've discussed in another one of these podcasts, our translation is more directed toward an audience of students and scholars. And our annotations are different and I would say complementary to the ones that are provided in their text. So there was a definite need for this text to appear in English with modern scholarly annotations, and that's what we've done. So I've been at work on this since 2011, firstly producing a handwritten translation in notebooks, which was then typed out by, among others, Dan here. And very grateful for your involvement. So much like all of the other versions of the Picatrix that have been published over the course of the last 100 years or so, this one has taken longer than expected and will be finally appearing in February 2019. And there's already a pre-order page. So
could you tell me a little bit about how you got interested in the subject?
Well, this is essentially an outgrowth of what has been the primary focus of my research, which is to try to figure out everything and anything possible about the mythical figure of Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the Thrice Great. The Picatrix is one of the texts that cites Hermes explicitly quite frequently. I think there's about a dozen different references to Hermes in this text, which put it on my radar screen when I was compiling all the references to Hermes that are extant in the Middle Ages, after St. Augustine's writings and before Marsilio Ficino. So the Picatrix loomed large there, and that's where the text came to my attention, essentially, and I realized that there's no proper English translation. As good as David Pingree's Latin edition is, and it's very much an example of how to do an edition well, the apparatus criticus to Pingree's edition is so large that it had to be included as a set of microfiche at the back of the physical book rather than have it be printed out itself, because the apparatus criticus is longer than the Picatrix text itself, which is quite a remarkable achievement for Pingree and presumably the cohort of students who helped him pull all this together. So my interest stems in the Picatrix stems from my work on Hermes. It also stems from being exposed to the text in various regards through the members and the meetings of the Societas Magica, which is a scholarly society for the study of magic and history. which has its annual meetings at the International Congress on Medieval Studies, hosted by the Medieval Institute at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, Michigan. So since 1994, roughly every year I've been going there, first as a member of the society, then as its vice president, and now as its president. And the text comes up again and again in the presentations that a large number of scholars have produced over the past couple of decades, and the glaringness of the lack of an English translation became more and more obvious over the years until I decided to just do one. And here we sit.
Right. And you were a student of Charles Burnett?
Student of Charles Burnett from the Warburg Institute, yes. So, I mean, my connection to the Picatrix comes, I guess, from several different directions, because the Warburg is precisely the publication house that has printed both the original Arabic edition, that's the only one that's currently available until Liana Saif has done her work. They also published Plessner's German translation, and they published in 1986 Pingree's edition. So I've, and it's while I was a PhD student at the Warburg Institute that I acquired my physical copy of the Picatrix, not knowing at the time that I would end up translating the whole thing. So it's still staring at both of us from the shelf that's right next to us here.
Yeah, and it's not cheap either.
It's not cheap. It's not cheap. I got it at a good discount.
And luckily, the Warburg Institute has made the Latin Picatrix, Pingree's edition, available for download for free in PDF form. I think all you got to do is Google search Latin Picatrix, Pingree, Warburg, something like that, and it should come up. I should mention that we, in putting together our translation, made it so that you should be able to follow along more easily with the Latin version. So if you look at the Greer and Warnock version, they don't have numbers like the Latin version does.
Yeah, the division of the text into books, then chapters, then paragraphs that Pingree included in his text is not there in the same kind of way.
Like you could figure it out. You
can figure it out. Our version keeps Pingree's division of the text down to the paragraph numbers, and also we've included in brackets the page numbers from Pingree that correspond where the pages change in Pingree. We have those corresponding numbers in our text everywhere, so anyone who has access to the Latin can compare our English to the Latin and derive more meaning thereby.
Right, though we should also mention that ours is a translatio ad sensum as well. So if, one of the words is missing, it's probably going to be a particle or something like that. We've cut it out for the sake of making the English more idiomatic, more English.
Yeah.
Because we want to know what the equivalent meaning is rather than necessarily the word for word equivalency. So often, if you are a student of Greek or Latin or one of these old languages, one of the best practices you can do as a student is write 2 translations for each thing that you do. So the first one is a very literal, exact 100% word for word rendering. And then in your second translation, you write a kind of clear, more meaningful, more idiomatic rendering. And that way you can sort of see your work.
Yeah.
And it's a good way to maintain the sense of what the text is trying to say.
Your suggestion's a very good one, and the first version amounts to a Latinese English translation, and then the second one amounts to a polished, readable, modern English version, and that's essentially what we've produced in our translation of the Picatrix.
Right. So you've also done a little bit of work on being the resident materialist in the duo, the material side of things. Could you talk a little bit about the gemstones and the crystals that appear in the Picatrix?
I certainly can do that, and the fact that precious stones occur so frequently ties in so frequently in the Picatrix and other magical texts of its type has to do with the theoretical background or intellectual framework that the readers of the Picatrix and other texts like it would have understood. And the primary connecting link here is the Neoplatonic hierarchy of being, whereby all of the universe is ordered by categories of soul, with soulless material objects being at the bottom, followed by plants who have a vegetative kind of soul because by virtue of their capacity for growth, followed by animal souls. Animals both grow and can move about, so they have an additional kind of soul. In addition to having a vegetative one, they have an animal soul. Humans are endowed with both of those, plus a rational soul, and so on. This ordering is based around capacity for movement, and the primary form of movement is growth. And it turns out that, of course, precious stones tend to be crystals, and crystals have a limited form of soul because they observably grow. And that explains the greater prominence and importance in esoteric operations, broadly speaking, of this particular subcategory of stones, as opposed to plain old granite or whatever.
Well, don't all precious metals grow inside of the Earth in the pre-modern worldview as a result of the penetration of stellar rays into the womb of the Earth? And humans are merely, by alchemical processes, speeding up the natural work of God.
Yeah, in terms of perfecting metals, absolutely. We are talking about stones, not metals, because
Right.
they're both part of the physical world, fair enough, and are both thought of as combinations of elements. But the prominence of precious stones and crystals amidst all the possible different types of stone, they stand out precisely because they were recognized as having this capacity for growth. And in addition to having fairly characteristic colors, bright colors associated with them. Metals have various properties that makes them unique among material goods, in that they can, through the application of heat, can be turned to liquid and back and forth and be amalgamated and melted into each other and so on. Stones are fairly are distinct that way because they're very distinct from each other and all bear peculiar characteristics that were thought to result from precisely the infusion of celestial rays, exactly as you're describing them. As I was saying, the Picatrix itself has quotes that demonstrate the importance of precious stones in the kinds of magical operations that it contains. So there's one spot in Book 4 where it says that precious stones are more excellent than the others, first of all. And another example comes when we hear that the construction of astral magic images is firmer with stones than with trees or animals, for the former burn easily and the latter rot. So it seems as though it's the permanence of stones, their lack of changeability, that makes them different from other types of materials that one might use in magical operations, as much as those other materials are also used, because there are several different recipes for things like suffumigations that require things that are combustible, obviously, right? So
but they are closer to the world of forms, and crystals especially so.
Crystals especially so for their regularity, the consistency of their color, and the fact that they can grow. And this brings me back to what we were saying earlier about the importance of the Picatrix in art history. It turns out that in portrait painting, when one sees lots of precious stones in the raiment of individuals, whether it be their rings or necklaces or woven into garments and so on, this was not only a means of displaying the individual's wealth, but also of displaying their esoteric protections and perhaps even means of hostile action should they use some of the stones in that direction. So it's an additional way of projecting power by displaying which stones you have at your disposal as a prominent Renaissance political or religious figure.
It's like layers of force fields against misfortunes.
And so the portrait paintings are not just meant to display one's finest cape, but also to project the power of the stones to the viewer, and so that any viewer will then associate a viewer in the know would be able to associate the powers of the stones with the individual in question. So what I'm interested in terms of stones is to see whether there's any connection between certain stones and which planets are invoked, which zodiacal signs are implicated in any given spell. Or perhaps spell is the wrong word to use.
Yes.
Magical ritual is probably...
Operation. Ritual. Even ritual is a loaded term with its own set of problems. Operation works too, but that also has problems because of the contemporary usage of the word for medical operations. So there is no real good word, but everything is simultaneously an anachronism.
Yeah, fair enough. I should point out here, first of all, that it's not only gems necessarily that are considered magically potent, because there are numerous ingredients throughout the Picatrix that that one wouldn't necessarily describe as either crystals or precious stones. I'm thinking of talc, of borax, of magnesium, of magnets. Magnets are peculiar on account of their manifest capacity to project invisible power over other objects, that they can attract things at a distance. And action at a distance, hidden action at a distance, is precisely what magic is all about. Mm-hmm. So it's no accident that a magnet, let's say, might appear in these operations. The one stone that was known to grow, but isn't a crystal, is the bezoar stone, that grows as an accumulation of contaminants in the bodies of animals, because calves, let's say, that are born don't have bezoar stones, but mature animals, when they die, were observed to have them. So this was clearly a stone that had the capacity for growth, but didn't necessarily have the regularity of a gem, of a crystal, such that, however, the fact that they were growing inside an animal suggests that they had peculiar powers associated with them, esoteric powers, precisely because that animal would have been influenced by the position of the celestial bodies at the time of its birth and throughout its life, such that that stone, by virtue of growing inside the animal, would acquire certain of the characteristics of that animal and of the celestial characteristics that animal lived under. Mm-hmm. So bezoar stones are also occur quite frequently in the Picatrix as a source of magical power, as a conduit for magical power. So among the stones that are found in the Picatrix, the ruby, the diamond, a crystal, and a pearl. Pearls, come to think of it, have similar characteristics to the bezoar stone in terms of how and where they grow. So, and yet they also count as precious stones. So let's say the half dozen most frequent precious stones that one finds is ruby, diamond, crystal, which is not described any more than that word, crystallum in Latin, the pearl, the emerald, and lapis lazuli. But the list does go on and is quite elaborate in terms of the number of different types of stone that are included, because we also see carnelian and marcasite and onyx and beryl, malachite, hematite, coral, bloodstone, garnet, jacinth, spinel, cameo, and jet all appear in varying frequencies in the Picatrix. So it's quite a fairly vast panoply of crystals. It's not like there's only 2 or 3 that are important. Many different stones were included. And many of them, what kinds of spells are associated or involve stones? Well, it seems as though rituals involving planets are the ones that tend to involve stones the most. And the Sun and Venus in particular are those that most frequently involve stones, and at the opposite end, Mars and Mercury are the 2 planets that don't necessarily use stones all that often. So in some of my research, I've created tables that in an attempt to see which stones are associated most regularly with which planets. And of the stones that are most frequently used, there is some amount of correlation that, for example, the emerald is associated with Mercury. There are 6 instances of that, and same thing with the ruby and the sun. But these are not exclusive. The emerald is also occasionally associated with Jupiter and the moon. The ruby, however, is exclusively associated with the sun, as is the spinel. So those instances where those 2 stones appear, they're systematically associated with a spell that calls upon the power of the sun. So those are simply examples. I have a whole table that I could talk about a great deal here, but I think constraints of time should keep us to simply describing that this kind of work has been done regarding stones, but a similar kind of associative procedure can be used to draw information regarding a whole bunch of other different ingredients, whether it's different types of herbs, whether it's different types of human body parts, different species of animals that are to be sacrificed in the Picatrix. These are all different angles of approach to this text that one can take that might yield interesting results in terms of opening a window into the mental space of the practitioners using this in the 15th, 16th centuries, let's say. Or perhaps even of al-Qurtubi himself when he compiled the original text. So by knowing which animals associate with which signs, associate with which planets, and so on, light can be shed on the whole mental scape that these people were living in.
Right. So that should probably, unless you have more things to say about stones, talk a little bit about animal sacrifice, since this is something that appears very prominently in the Picatrix. So I think it's worth mentioning that there are two inlets with which we have to think about animal sacrifice. The first is the reception of classical sources. And so there is an echo of the ancient paganism of late antiquity, whereby animal sacrifice was still practiced. So that's the one dimension. And the other dimension is the element of rays, which is an Arabic innovation. This is not a concept that comes from late antiquity. This is the idea that the animals and basically all living things are fed on the rays from specific astrological configurations. And when we sacrifice those animals, when we kill them violently in one blow, we release those rays back into the plenum of rays, and thereby we can manipulate the direction of the stellar rays into, depending on what it is we're trying to achieve. We can use these sacrifices to redirect rays, but it has to do with scattering rays. And so it's worth talking about that for a bit.
Yeah, I would suggest that the ritual context is really important in terms of the intentional release of the rays versus the accidental slaying of an animal or its slaughter merely for the sake of food. The ritual context is what is meant to employ the rays that were thought to be released upon the killing of the animal.
And it's the same with fumigation.
Yes. Because, a forest fire will burn all kinds of plants.
Yeah, and you are releasing those rays back into the plenum of astral influence.
And without a ritual context, though that release is not directed to a specific end, and it's the ritual context creates the conditions under which a certain end can be aimed for through the various actions that are called upon. The prayers that are associating, that are part of the ritual, help link the macrocosm to the microcosm of the animal that's being killed, and the operator who's doing the killing, and the intent, the focused will of the operator in question. Now, it's interesting to me that the theory of rays helps, even though it's a much later add-on that is to animal sacrifice, which pre-existed the theory of rays by a whole lot, but it's an add-on that helps explain why the animal sacrifice might be thought to work, because this animal sacrifice in the context of ancient pagan polytheistic religion was always a bit of a conundrum, not a conundrum, but a mystery in terms of why people did it in the first place. And there's a whole host of different theories that come from antiquity itself. Scholars in antiquity were puzzled by why this practice continued.
Well, I think there's something to be said about the difference between the pagan mode of doing sacrifice and the Semitic mode of doing sacrifice. The Holocaust, the full burning of the animal and completely giving it up, ruining it essentially, versus the pagan mode of sacrifice, which is a giant meat party.
Yeah.
it's probably the only time you would get to eat meat.
Yep.
And so a wealthy patron would buy an animal, sacrifice it to a specific god, and everybody would get together and partake of that. And so there is kind of social cohesion in the pagan element, whereas in the Semitic element, it's more of a covenant.
A giving up of something valuable for the sake of having one's relationship with a divinity recognized.
Right, but on a transcendental plane.
Yes.
As opposed to on an immanent plane, which is what the do ut des method of, I sacrifice part of my seed so that I will have grain next year. Yeah. It's like I sacrifice this animal to produce food. And I mean, there is many dimensions we can think about this. There is no one particular reason for sacrifice. It's a very complex, I don't want to call it an industry, but it's a complex
social practice.
Human practice that transcends cultures, and each culture would have a different system underpinning how they actually considered these things to work.
True enough, and certainly in Greco-Roman paganism, they also did have the full Holocaust sacrifice as well as a different modality of sacrifice under certain circumstances for certain deities.
Or even human sacrifice in certain circumstances.
Yep. Sometimes to reproduce stories from myth, and like I said earlier, in some instances, scholars simply throw up their hands and say, well, there's these various explanations. Each of them is unsatisfactory for certain reasons, but satisfactory for others. And they just sort of do a lot of hand waving and shrug, and we don't get a real answer as to what common understanding there may have been about sacrifice of any sort in ancient paganism. If there even was a common understanding, and it doesn't appear that there was one.
I don't think we need to suppose that there would be one.
Fair enough.
I think that we would pigeonhole ourselves and get in trouble.
Fair enough. What's really interesting in the Picatrix, however, is that the description of the rituals that involve the sacrifice of an animal, in many instances, match very, very closely with what is known about the practices of ancient pagan animal sacrifice in religious contexts. And that parallel is suggestive, at the very least, that what we may be in the presence of in certain portions of the Picatrix is precisely a writing down and fairly detailed descriptions of the sorts of sacrifices precisely that were done by the ancient pagans.
Yeah, it'll be like, you need an unspeckled animal, you need to crown the horns of the bull, you need to hit it with, I don't know if an axe was necessarily something that's elucidated in the Picatrix, but there are some fairly specific things that sound like something you would read out of a classical author.
Out of a classical author, and the prayers to the planets that accompany these sacrifices that I'm thinking of here, the planets themselves are ancient pagan deities, aren't they? So I should probably qualify that statement a little bit in terms of the individual who is writing the Rayat al-Hakim, as well as those reading the eventual Latin Picatrix, didn't necessarily conceive of the planets as these anthropomorphic ancient deities per se. What I'm wanting to point out when I say that is essentially these prayers to the planets may represent echoes of ancient religious prayers, considering how conservative the ancient pagans always were with regard, and conservative and scrupulous about the continuity of their ancient practices, in particular when it comes to prayers. We may be in the presence of ancient pagan liturgies when we read these prayers to the planets, especially those ones that are accompanied by animal sacrifice, where the descriptions correspond very closely to the descriptions we have from antiquity. I don't want to suggest that there is a continuity of practice, but at the very least, there might be a continuity in terms of the wording. that it was that these prayers preserve something of, at least something of the flavor of the liturgies that one might have heard in the context of ancient pagan religious practice. That then gets transferred into a world of magical practice is an interesting thing to observe in itself, because broadly, to speak overly broadly, one person's religion is another person's magic. And here we have the repurposing of what had originally been possibly religious rituals transformed for operational objectives in the context of the Picatrix.
Right. Though in the case specifically, okay, so this is a good time to make a distinction clear between the practical talismanic material that's in the Picatrix and the invocations, which are also technically practical, but our author is wary of, in the same way Ficino was okay with the talismanic portion and wary of the invocations, even al-Qurtubi is okay with the talismans. These are just scientific kind of objects, if we can use that term. Whereas the invocations to the old gods, the author tells us himself, this is something that people did long ago in the past, and this is what the sages, the wise men of the past used to do. So I'm relating it now for you, but this was stuff that was going on before the law was passed. And now within a Muslim context, obviously the law is the Quran, whereas a Christian would read this and probably presume Moses, depending on how good their knowledge of Islam was at the time. But that's actually something that happens a lot in the Picatrix, is mentions of the founder of the law, which is, on one level, it's pretty unambiguously supposed to be referring to Muhammad, at least from the intention of the author. Whereas if it were being received in Christian lands, they would assume Moses.
Yeah, and those passages that mention the law, even though in the original context we know that it has to do with the Quran, those passages are left in precisely because of that ambiguity, I would suggest. In that the equation of those passages with Moses would have been a natural thing for a Christian audience to do, and that's one of the reasons those particular bits are left in, whereas other more explicit references to surahs and this kind of thing are excised between the Arabic and the Latin versions.
Right. All right. Is there anything else we want to discuss about this distinction between the talismanic and the invocations? I suppose for those who are unfamiliar with the material, the talismans are made of specific metals at specific times, and they're engraven with specific images that correspond to either decanic or zodiacal images. And then these are infused with the stellar rays. And the idea is that you can, depending on what goal it is you're trying to achieve, you can craft these talismans to achieve your end. These are suffumigated usually on a cross. So you are setting up this cross made out of the metal of the planet, hanging your talisman off of it, and then joining it with the suffumigation. So the idea is you're taking all of these disparate parts of nature and literally bringing them all together into one place, and it creates a kind of gravity well. Might be the best analogy to think about how the rays then start to fold through space and bend into the location that you're trying to make them come together in. And so, yeah, I think a gravity well might be the best image. Whereas the invocations are a different practice. You dress yourself in the robes of the color of the planet. You pick their hours. You pick the... often there's suffumigations involved in this too. That is the common, I suppose, link between those two kinds of operations is suffumigation. You make your invocations of specific prayers that are laid out in the Picatrix, and then you should be able to talk with the spirit of a given planet. And that is different from the talismanic operations. But both of these kinds of magical operations, along with other kinds, exist side by side in the Picatrix. But you'll see they're separated by what source they're coming from.
Yeah, al-Qurtubi is reasonably diligent about acknowledging his sources.
So al-Tabari is the source of the planetary invocations, and he was a Sabaean from Haran, whereas the talismans come from sources like Al-Kindi, from sources like Ibn Washia, although I wouldn't be surprised if, I'm pretty sure Ibn Washia has some temple-oriented sacrificial passages too, because he's trying to resurrect the ancient wisdom of the Nabateans, which is essentially Babylonian paganism.
There's also multiple references to Jabir or Geber, depending on how you want to pronounce it, who is a semi-mythical figure from early Islam in this field of science / natural philosophy. And it should be added, I guess, at this point that the what we would call magic in the Picatrix was conceived of by its author and its translators as a component of science. This was legitimate investigation of the operations of nature and their use, their application. So there's pure science and there's applied science, both of which come together in the Picatrix.
Right, but we need to be careful with the word science.
Yes,
because
agreed.
Science in the Middle Ages means bodies of knowledge, not the scientific method.
Correct. Although the Hebrew version of the Picatrix does preserve a fairly succinct description of what we would call the scientific method.
Yes.
Of testing hypotheses and this kind of thing.
Which is very interesting. I believe Martin Plesner has written an article about it. And it would technically be the earliest attestation of the scientific method in the West. But what's strange is that it doesn't occur in the Latin version. It's only in the Hebrew translation. Yep. So I haven't read it. I don't read Hebrew. I probably never will. But it is an interesting thing to think about. And that article is quite fascinating.
I wanted, as a little segue in from animal sacrifice, I just wanted to highlight the work of Sophie Page, who has an article out precisely on the on animal sacrifice in the Picatrix, and to link it back to what we were saying earlier as well, she's published a book called Magic in the Cloister, which examines the monks at St. Augustine's Monastery in Canterbury, which it turns out was a hotbed of interest in the esoteric, broadly speaking. And these are the people who are essentially the literate clerics who are the ones preserving these texts and copying them and possibly practicing them. That's a difficult call to make in terms of going from theoretical interest to actual usage. It's a leap that is probably not safe to make from a rigorous scholarly perspective, but it's tantalizing at least.
Well, it's worth mentioning here that St. Augustine's library, which was a 2,000 book library, was inherited by John Dee. And he then had the largest library in England.
Of esoterica.
Yes, but often there were, and this is something that's explored in Sophie's book, is that a lot of these magical texts were bound together with non-magical books. So, but it's unsure whether they're trying to hide the books in these books or maybe neuter them, or there's all manner of ways you can think about why these more notorious texts are being bound up with more benign ones. But it's worth mentioning that the Picatrix was not in and among these books, but the Secret of Secrets is, for example.
Which is cited very frequently in the Picatrix itself. So, on our to-do list for today?
So, the last thing we want to talk about is Adocentyn.
Right. The Hermetic Utopia, which I had occasion to present at a conference at St. Thomas More College in Saskatchewan a couple of years ago on the 500th anniversary, in honor of the 500th anniversary of Thomas More's Utopia. The work I presented there had to do precisely with arguing that the Adocentyn passage from the Picatrix amounts to a Hermetic Utopia.
Did you know that Thomas More wrote a life of Pico della Mirandola?
No.
Yes, and he was introduced to Pico, well, posthumously, after Pico had died, by John Colet, his friend. And, yeah, he was actually quite fascinated with Pico's work, and that's probably, if there is a concrete link, where you would find it.
Interesting. So essentially, Adocentyn amounts to a non-rational Hermetic Utopia. And it's a fairly short passage. It's only about 315 words in English. It's 251 words in Latin. So it's a one-page kind of passage that...
Can I make a qualifying statement before we jump in?
Of course.
Adocentyn is a kind of historiographical mirage.
Yes.
It's important to say that the idea, the concept of this magical city, Adocentyn, which is a Western concept, because in the Eastern reception of the Gayat al-Hakim, there isn't an Adocentyn. It's al-Ashmunain, and that is just the, I think, Coptic name. And so there's this sort of Western nostalgia for Egypt, this, I guess, what we could call Platonic Orientalism in this case, where people project a utopian ideal into ancient Egypt. And largely what has been made of the Adocentyn myth emerges from this tradition of reception of this story. So it's like, as the translation garbled along and was received by different people, it created a mental city that is only in the minds of Westerners, and it is the result of a bunch of translation efforts. So it's strange in that this utopia may have had quite a wide-ranging impact, I suppose, coupled with Plato's Republic, because we can never forget that utopia, or Augustine's City of God. But yeah, Adocentyn is very interesting in that way, that it's something of a mirage.
It's a mirage that may well have played a role in the elaboration of other utopian creations by Tommaso Campanella, by Thomas More, because the sort of city that it describes is very much idealized and summarizes... First of all, it's consistent, broadly speaking, with everything else that one does see in the Picatrix, and in fact in the in treatises attributed to Hermes Trismegistus elsewhere as well, in terms of it employing thought by analogy in order to link colors to planets, to various trees.
Even the link from Thoth to Hermes is one of these analogies. And from Hermes to Hermes Trismegistus, who's a totally different figure.
The Adocentyn passage in the Picatrix, broadly speaking, is consonant not only within the theorizing of the Picatrix itself, but it's also, we would describe it as totalitarian in a similar way to Thomas More's Utopia, in the sense that, and it makes this passage, Adocentyn passage, belong firmly within the utopic tradition as a precursor to Thomas More's work, in the sense that the properties that are ascribed to various components of this city are meant to identify vice amongst the inhabitants.
Yeah, it's a surveillance state.
It's a surveillance state, exactly, which is kind of unsettling to read.
But also an internalized surveillance state. There's a kind of panopticon effect where people internalize their repression, and then they don't act out in unlawful ways because there are these statues set up around the city that can basically detect their sins.
Is it worth us reading the whole passage? Just for the sake of completeness here, since it's so short.
I think so. We should read it.
Okay.
So this is in section 431 of the Picatrix. Yeah. So I'm reading from Book 4, Chapter 3, Section 1. The Chaldeans, who initiated themselves into this work and science, are magi. These men are considered most competent in this science. The magi claim that Hermes was the first to build a kind of house of statues. With these statues, he would measure the length of the Nile all the way to the mountain of the moon. Here, he built the house of the sun. Moreover, he occulted himself from humankind such that none in his presence could see him. It was Hermes, indeed, who built the eastern city of Egypt 12 miles long, wherein he erected a tower with 4 gates on its 4 sides. At the eastern gate, he placed a statue of an eagle. On the western gate, that of a bull. On the southern gate, that of a lion. And on the northern one, that of a dog. Hermes caused loud-voiced spiritual entities to enter them. Nobody could enter that tower's gates without the entity's permission. There, he also planted certain kinds of trees, in the middle of which stood a great tree that bore every type of fruit. At the summit of that tower, he built a kind of turret 30 cubits in height, on top of which he placed a round orb whose color would change according to each of the 7 days. At the end of the 7 days, however, the cycle began anew. Every day that city was covered by the color of that orb, and thus it glowed differently each day. Around the turret there was abundant water where plenty of fish dwelled. He set up various statues of every kind around the city, and by their power the inhabitants were made virtuous, free from sin and wicked idleness. This city was called Adocentyn. These people had been taught in the knowledge of the ancients, their depths and secrets, along with the science of astronomy.
Okay, so great. Essentially, one can break down that passage and make various comments about it along the way. At the beginning, we hear about the Chaldeans, which was essentially the traditional name for a Near Eastern culture well versed in astrology. From the perspective of someone reading Latin in the Middle Ages, these might correspond to what we think of today as Babylonians, as Akkadians. It's difficult to say. The association is mostly geographical and with astrology in particular.
But in the Christian consciousness, Abraham comes from Ur of the Chaldees, and so the Chaldeans are the Babylonians.
It's interesting to note that the Arabic text has Copts rather than Chaldeans here, which reinforces the link with Egypt.
Right.
This passage.
Well, and the name Ashmunain
exactly.
is a Coptic name for Hermopolis. So it is really Copts who are reporting this, but from the perspective of a medieval reader, they would take this at face value and think, oh, the Babylonians who are somehow in Egypt.
The Magi that claim that Hermes was the first to build a particular house of statues, these statues are intended to be understood as astrological talismans. And this legend could perhaps even, the legend of Adocentyn that has houses of statues, provides a basis to some extent for the practices that we know of planetary worship at Haran by those self-proclaimed Sabaeans.
But I think that the House of Statues here is more akin to these. There were these buildings that were set up along the Nile that checked the water level, and there were, they were decorated with images and frescoes and statues and such. And that's how he was calculating the flow of the Nile.
So the passage itself says the length of the Nile, and that might be a misinterpretation and intended to mean flow. The reference to the mountain of the moon There is in Ptolemy's geography a passage referring to exactly that, the mountains of the moon, which are said to be one of the sources of the Nile. And among some of the modern identifications that have been made of this particular section refers to the Rwenzori Mountains in Uganda, which are snow-capped, and this may be a reference to those. If the talismanic images that we're talking about were sculptures, they could in fact be used to find the length of the Nile on account of the length of the shadow. That's perhaps wishful thinking on our part. It's more likely that we're talking about divination here, but nevertheless.
Yeah, it could also be like milestones.
Yes. Absolutely.
So there's actually a whole bunch of ways that you can think about this. But if we had to match it to the archaeology, it's these giant, I forget what they're called. They're like watershed houses. And they basically measure, you can put marks for how high the Nile is, and you can calculate at what time of year the flow is high and what time it's low, and plan accordingly. So there's an idea of bringing civilization and agriculture, and that's something we have to remember about Hermes, is that the thrice great Hermes is thrice great because he is a priest, a king, and a prophet. Mm-hmm. So it's all those aspects rolled into one.
The house of the sun that's referred to in the passage has a parallel in the Bible in terms of the Beth Shemesh and Jeremiah 43:13. It's unclear what relationship that house of the sun has with the Egyptian city of Heliopolis on the southeast end of the Nile Delta. We know that there were temples in Haran dedicated to planetary deities, including presumably a house of the sun, and it's difficult to disentangle these multiple traditions in this relatively short passage. The passage carries on to describe how Hermes occulted himself from humankind such that no one could see him. Is this a tacit acknowledgement of the fictionality or spiritual nature of Hermes, or is it more likely that Hermes is a wizard and one of his abilities is to hide himself, to go invisible?
Well, this is something that the imams do, and I think that this is a dimension that we can borrow from Shiite imamology.
Yeah, the hidden imam tradition.
Yeah, the idea of going into occultation, and I don't know, you go to a pocket plane or something, but the text is very clear that it's possible that here Hermes is just removing himself and going into hiding, but it says that in the text that nobody in his presence could see him.
Yep.
So it kind of softens the idea that there might be some sort of just relinquishing civilization as opposed to a full-on magical occultation going on.
And there is, in certainly the Western tradition, instances of magicians vanishing in front of people. Mm-hmm. We have Zalmoxis from Book 4 of Herodotus.
Although he goes into a hole.
And there's also Apollonius of Tyana, who vanishes in front of Domitian. Mm. So there's...
And invisibility is a spell that's in the Picatrix.
It is.
It's in one of Plato's greater books on magic.
Yeah, of all things. So it was Hermes, the next phrase sees Hermes building an eastern city of Egypt 12 miles long. This is where the probably links to the Hermopolis that's in Egypt, which is El Ashmunain in the modern Egyptian town. It's Al Ashmunain in the Hayat al-Hakim. And this is a good example of there being consistency within the Hermetic tradition of Hermes perennially being associated with Egypt, Hermes the Thrice Great in particular. But here we have a distinction between Heliopolis and Hermopolis that we have to keep in mind, that there is a Hermopolis on the western bank of the Nile, so there's some amount of geographical confusion happening here, it seems. The tower that has 4 gates on its 4 sides, the Latin is unclear in terms of whether the gates are 1 each on 4 sides of a square sort of setup, or is it 4 each on each of 4 sides for 16 different gates? Because the text we have is, wherein he erected a tower with 4 gates on its 4 sides. So there's some ambiguity here. One of the possible sources for this passage from the Arabic confirms that it's one per side in principle. The confirmation can also be found in the very next sentence, where we hear at the eastern gate, he places the image of an eagle, on the western bull, on the southern a lion, and the northern that of a dog. There are close analogues to this combination of four animals. We have in book 1 of Ezekiel. We also have a parallel passage in a book entitled Akhbar al-Zaman, which also has four animals in a similar sort of arrangement. There's also the symbolic associations of the four evangelists that in a Christian context...
That's a later attribution.
It's a later attribution, but in a Christian context, a Christian reader of the Middle Ages...
Yeah, the Copts would have picked up on that.
Yep.
So it's worth mentioning this. So we have the four faces of the four statues at the four faces of the tower. And so they're an eagle, a bull, a lion, and a dog. So if you think about the chariot that's being pulled in Ezekiel by these angels, they have four faces, and they have the face of an eagle, a bull, a lion, and a human.
Yep.
Now, here we have a dog instead of a human face, and I'm actually not sure. I wonder if this swapping out the human for a dog face, it has something to do with injunctions in the Islamic world against anthropomorphic depictions.
Yeah, that's a totally sensible conjecture.
Right. But we would need to be able to check that against other sources. But it is something worth mentioning that these statues are kind of identified with these angelic faces.
Yep.
And the theme there, usually as people describe it, is that the lion represents the wilderness, like wild animal nature. The eagle represents its own form of that. And then we have the bull, which represents the tame, civilized, domesticated form of the animal nature, and the human, who is human. So, I mean, really what is being signaled here is a plenum, is a fullness of human or of living experience.
Passage carries on with loud-voiced spiritual entities entering these statues, and there's a long-standing tradition in the Hermetica of infusing statues with spirits for the sake of prophecy. The passage that St. Augustine cites from the Latin Asclepius Hermetic text is precisely about that. Augustine is quoting it disparagingly, but nevertheless it's present in the Latin Asclepius that infusing a statue with a spirit in order for it to utter prophecy is part and parcel of the Hermetic tradition, and it appears not only in the Asclepius, we also hear about it in Iamblichus, and there's archaeological evidence for the practice of having statues carry human voices through a complex set of tubing that's been discovered by archaeologists in certain Greco-Roman temples.
Also in Anatolia.
Anatolia, Egypt as well. And in a different Picatrix passage from Book 3, we have a King Behentater, who was the founder of the city of Memphis in Egypt, who also used speaking statues. So there's some measure of internal consistency within the Picatrix itself with regard to this particular element. So the fact that no one can enter the tower's gates without permission involves the consistency with other bindings rituals that are part of the Picatrix, which are essentially rituals that force movement or hamper movement in particular ways. So these are quite frequent in magical collections, and the fact that these statues that carry loud voices are barring people from entering suggests that they are components of magical binding that's built into this city of Adocentyn.
Well, there's also, you could say, more down to earth. There's like an element of fear
as well.
But also, Picatrix has lots of injunctions against letting people see where it is you are practicing your magic, where it is you are performing your operations. So this would be definitely synonymous with that.
Yeah. The Adocentyn version seems to correspond to binding spells that release upon the utterance of a specific magical word, I should say. And it's a subtype that occurs both in the Picatrix itself, in Book 1, Chapter 5, there's one, and these also appear elsewhere in magical literature, like in the Greek magical papyri. So the next sentence, the next phrase has certain kinds of trees in the middle of which, which also has a great tree that bears every kind of fruit. Fruit productivity is the concern of several different spells in the Picatrix elsewhere, and the Hermetic tradition also includes herbals. So we have this other additional component of continuity here.
You can also argue for a kind of tree of life motif
as well. Yep.
And I mean, a tree that bears all the different kind of fruits is a utopian picture in and of itself.
Yep. Then we have the association with this tower with a turret on top that's 30 cubits high, with a round orb that projects a certain color across the town across the city according to each of 7 days. Every day the city would be covered by the color of that orb, and the city glowed differently each day. The colors associated with days, associated with planets, is something that occurs several different times elsewhere in the Picatrix. The effect of rays, this is essentially an artificial way of projecting rays within the city.
Right.
It amounts to this Hermetic Utopia adopting or artificializing, I guess, operationalizing what the planets themselves do naturally.
Right.
And it's a way of controlling and doling out the power of each of the planets in turn to bless the citizenry or bathe the citizenry in these rays such that they might benefit.
If everybody is aware of what the planetary hours are, there can be no mistakes. There can be no misfortunes, because the educated populace would act accordingly. There would be no ambiguity.
The color scheme in the other passages of the Picatrix isn't always 100% consistent, but there's enough consistency to suggest that this is the sort of thing that's going on. Around the turret, there is lots of water. Spells or rituals, I should say, for gathering and catching fish appear elsewhere in the Picatrix, and we also see the aforementioned King Behentater, who was in possession of an ever-full jug that he would water his troops with.
Oh, it's like a kind of monolith that gathers water from the salty water nearby, I presume from the Dead Sea or something.
That's a different thing.
Is it?
So there's that, which appears somewhere in the Picatrix, and I don't quite remember where, but there's also King Behentater, who has a jug that was always full, that he could always pour out glasses of water for his troops. So the fact that there is abundant water and fish in the Adocentyn passage suggests that at least continuity with the rest of the Picatrix. Various images set up around the city that by their power make the inhabitants virtuous, free from sin, and free from wicked idleness.
We should talk about the word images for a minute.
Yes.
Image is a tricky, slippery word, because image can mean statue and it can mean talisman.
Yes.
And it can just mean image, but it can also be one of these things without being the others.
Yes.
And it's not really clear which one it is. It doesn't really matter because the effect is the same. But yeah, an image is everything from a picture to a sigil to a talisman to a picture on a talisman.
To a 3D sculpture.
Yeah, to a possibly. 3D sculpture, to the images that are in the heavens.
Yep. Yes. Yeah, the constellations and such. It's difficult to tell from this passage whether it's meant to enforce virtue through compulsion or through mere surveillance that creates an internalized self-guarding from sin.
A Foucauldian panopticon.
Exactly. I mean, rituals and talismans to detect adulterers and thieves and so on exist in the Picatrix as well as in other analogous magical collections. The implications here are that the Adocentyn's talismans could detect adulterers, thieves, murderers, the indolent, and so on. And that this does amount, in fact, to a talisman-driven magical panopticon, which is totalitarian in a very similar way that Moore's Utopia is set up.
Or Plato's Republic.
So that brings
or
us...
Campanella's City of the Sun, or Christianopolis, the
Yes.
Rosicrucian Utopia.
Good point.
There's a bunch of these utopias that just start popping up
Yep.
right around, well, I suppose 50 years after the Picatrix has been back in circulation. You get Thomas More, and I suspect that Thomas More wrote a life of Pico della Mirandola, and he learnt about Pico from his friend John Collett. So I suspect if there is a vector of Picatrixian thought coming into Thomas More, it would be from that angle, because Pico knew of the Picatrix.
Yep.
And Ficino did too. And Ficino's influence can't be under emphasized. He translated all the works of Plato and the Corpus Hermeticum.
Yeah.
I mean, he really did create the agenda of study for so many people in generations to come after him.
Yeah, and it is a significant inspiration for Agrippa, among others. So that wraps up our conversation, I think, to do with Adocentyn, certainly.
Yes,
I don't know if there's anything else we wanted to add.
I think
at this
so.
point.
I don't know what else there is to say other than the fact that Adocentyn is a funny place because it's a place in our heads.
Yes.
I mean, it's part of a textual tradition, but it's a tradition that is kind of alive and green.
Yeah.
And people have taken that and run with it in different ways. So I think that that's something worth mentioning. Do we have any closing thoughts?
Closing thoughts. The Picatrix is coming out in February 2019.
Yeah, so get yourselves a copy. I believe the first run of prints are limited to 1,000 hardcover copies. After that, there will be likely a reprint, and those will be both in hard copy and paperback. It's fairly affordable. I believe the price is $40 US, which is nice that the press managed to keep the cost down. And if you have any suggestions, we are very, very open to corrections, to different interpretations that people might have. If you have the actual evidence behind why you think something is the way that it is and it ought to be changed, let us know, because academic scholarly works are processes. They're not events. They do come out once, but that's why they're constantly being re-edited, because we like to have as accurate a picture as we can possibly generate.
Yeah, it's an asymptotic approach to perfection. Never quite reach it, but you strive for it a great deal.
Right.
We're also very open to taking suggestions for new topics to consider for future discussions as well. Any questions you may have and this kind of thing, we can address in future analogous podcasts to this one. Right.
I have been trying to spread myself around and kind of talk about a little bit of everything, but it's a 400-page book, so there's always more to talk about.
Oh, and one little thing to point out regarding the book is that it is very thoroughly indexed. Unlike any of the other modern language translations, which do not have any indices, we modeled our translation off of the layout of Pingree's, wherein he has 70-odd pages of index, of 3 different indices, in fact, which we also have. One to do with celestial and divine names, another to do with terrestrial names and place names, and another to do with subjects and materials. So if you perhaps lack the patience to go from cover to cover in this book, it's possible to dip in via the index to certain concepts, ideas, things, animals, plants, whatever. We've done our very best to make all of that easily accessible via a thoroughly put together index.
Right. And I suppose in the winter we will be delving even deeper into Picatrix, so we may have some additional insights to share a few months from now.
As a result of a senior seminar and graduate level seminar that I'm running at the University of Waterloo during the winter 2019 term on the Picatrix and the classical tradition, of which Dan will be a contributing member.
And I'm very excited for that.
As am I.
So I think that that's everything that we need to discuss today. And so I am Dan Attrell, and I'm signing off.
And I'm David Porreca, and I'm also signing off.
So thanks for being with us, David.
Thank you very kindly for having me.